The rain hammered against the windows of the Harrison estate like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. Marcus Harrison stood in the study, staring at the leather-bound ledger his father had left behind. 3 days had passed since the funeral. 3 days since they'd lowered Richard Harrison into the ground beneath a marble monument that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The old man had finally released his grip on the world, and Marcus had expected to feel relief, perhaps even joy. Instead, there was only this gnawing emptiness and the weight of the ledger in his hands. "You should rest," his wife Sarah said from the doorway, her voice soft with concern. She'd been trying to comfort him since they returned from the cemetery, but Marcus knew she didn't understand. Nobody did. They all thought he was grieving, that he mourned his father like any son would. They didn't know about the decades of resentment, the years of living in the shadow of a man who seemed to have everything while giving nothing that mattered. Marcus shook his head. "I need to go through his papers. The lawyers are coming tomorrow." Sarah crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The lawyers can wait. You've been in here since dawn." He pulled away, not unkindly, but with the firmness of a man who'd made up his mind. "I've waited 38 years, Sarah. I can wait a few more hours to sleep." She sighed, recognizing the futility of argument, and left him alone with his father's ghosts. Marcus returned his attention to the ledger. The entries went back 40 years, meticulous records of every dollar earned, every investment made, every acquisition completed. Richard Harrison had built an empire from nothing, or so the story went. A self-made man, they called him, a titan of industry, a philanthropist whose name graced hospital wings and university buildings. Marcus had heard it all his life, every time someone learned whose son he was. "Richard Harrison? The Richard Harrison? You must be so proud!" And Marcus would smile and nod, playing the role of the grateful heir, while inside he seethed with an envy that had calcified into something harder and darker over the years. Because Richard Harrison might have been a giant in the world, but at home he was barely present. Marcus's childhood memories were filled with empty chairs at dinner tables, missed baseball games, and birthday parties where his father sent expensive gifts, but never himself. His mother had made excuses, speaking of important meetings and vital business trips, but Marcus had seen the truth in her eyes. She was lonely too, trapped in a mansion with every comfort except the one that mattered. She died when Marcus was 19, her heart giving out one winter morning while Richard was in Tokyo closing a deal. Marcus had called him, voice breaking as he delivered the news. "I'll be home as soon as I can," Richard had said, and then spent another 3 days abroad finalizing contracts before returning for the funeral. Even then, Marcus had caught him on his phone during the wake, discussing stock options in hushed tones while mourners paid their respects. Marcus had sworn he'd be different. When he married Sarah, he'd promised himself he wouldn't become his father, and he'd kept that promise, mostly. He'd built a modest consulting business, nothing compared to Richard's empire, but enough to live comfortably. He'd been present for Sarah, for the life they'd built together. They'd tried for children, but it hadn't happened, and maybe that was a blessing. At least he wouldn't pass on the Harrison legacy of emotional absence. But the envy had never left him. It whispered to him every time his father's name in the newspaper, every time someone mentioned the Harrison fortune, every time he drove past one of the buildings his father owned. Marcus had enough, certainly, but his father had everything. And worse, Richard seemed so content with his choices, so satisfied with his life of acquisition and achievement. He never appeared to regret the relationships he'd sacrificed, the moments he'd missed, the son he'd barely known. The study door opened again, and this time it was James, his father's longtime attorney. The old lawyer looked haggard, his usual composure frayed around the edges. "Marcus, I'm sorry to intrude. I know we're meeting tomorrow, but there's something I need to discuss with you tonight." Marcus set down the ledger. "What is it?" James closed the door carefully and crossed to the desk. He was carrying a manila envelope, worn and creased as if handled many times over many years. "Your father left specific instructions. This was to be given to you on the 3rd night after his death, and only if you'd begun examining his records." "How did you know I'd be doing that tonight?" A sad smile crossed James's face. "Because he knew you, Marcus, better than you think. He said you'd need exactly 3 days, 1 day for shock, 1 day for the funeral arrangements, and 1 day to start feeling the anger again. He said on the 3rd night you'd be in his study, looking through his ledgers, trying to understand how he did it all." Marcus felt a chill run through him. "He said that?" Those were his exact words. James placed the envelope on the desk. "I'm to leave you alone to read this, but Marcus, I want you to know something first. I worked with your father for 35 years. I thought I knew him. After reading what's in that envelope, I realized I didn't know him at all. None of us did." Before Marcus could respond, James had left, closing the door quietly behind him. Marcus stared at the envelope for a long moment, his hand hovering over it. Part of him wanted to throw it into the fireplace unread, to reject whatever final manipulation his father had planned, but curiosity and that old familiar envy won out. He opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The first page was a letter in his precise handwriting. Marcus recognized it immediately. Despite all the years and all the distance, he'd received enough birthday cards and Christmas notes to know those careful, measured letters. "My dear Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're angry. You've spent the last 3 days wondering why you don't feel the grief that's expected, guilty because part of you is relieved I'm gone, and another part of you is furious that I left you with questions that will never be answered. I know this because I know you, son. I've always known you, even when you thought I wasn't paying attention." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. "You've envied me your whole life. Don't deny it. I saw it in your eyes at every family gathering, every business function, every moment when someone praised my success. You thought I had everything while you had nothing, that I chose wealth over family, ambition over love. You thought I was content with my choices, satisfied with the empire I built while you stood in its shadow. You were wrong about almost everything, Marcus, but you were right about one thing. I did make a choice, just not the one you think." Marcus set the first page aside and looked at the second. It was a document, old and yellow, dated 39 years earlier, a medical report from a clinic in Switzerland. He scanned the text, struggling to process what he was reading. Then his eyes caught on a single line, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. "Patient presents with advanced pancreatic cancer. Prognosis, terminal. Estimated survival without aggressive treatment, 6 months. With treatment, 2 to 3 years, with significant reduction in quality of life." The date on the report was 6 months before Marcus was born. He looked at the next document, another medical report, this one 2 years later, and another 4 years after that. Test results, treatment notes, experimental trials, page after page documenting a battle against a disease that should have killed his father before Marcus took his first breath. His father's letter continued on the next page. "I was 29 years old when they gave me my death sentence. Your mother was 3 months pregnant with you. We'd just found out, just started planning our future as a family,
And then, in one appointment, that future evaporated. 6 months, they said, maybe a year if I was lucky. I would never hold you, never see you take your first steps, never teach you to throw a ball or ride a bike. I would be dead before you were old enough to remember my face. Marcus's eyes were burning now, but he kept reading. Your mother wanted me to spend my last months with her, to cherish the time we had. And God, Marcus, I wanted that too, more than I've ever wanted anything. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept that you would grow up without a father, that your mother would be left alone, that my family would have nothing after I was gone. So I made a decision that has haunted me every day since then. I decided to fight, not just for time, but for security, for your future.
I told myself I would change, that now that I was healthy, I could finally be the father I'd always wanted to be. But here's what I learned, Marcus. What I learned too late. You can't reclaim lost time. You can't rebuild a relationship that was never properly built in the first place. Every time I tried to connect with you, I saw the wall you'd built, and I didn't know how to break through it. I'd spent so many years being absent that I didn't know how to be present. And your mother, God rest her soul, she'd built her own walls too. We'd become strangers living in the same house, united only by our love for you and our complete inability to show it in ways you could understand. Marcus sat back down heavily, his mind reeling. He thought of his mother, of the sadness he'd always seen in her eyes. Had she known? Had she carried this secret alone, watching her husband fight for survival while appearing to abandon his family? The next document was a journal entry in his mother's handwriting, dated a year after the diagnosis. Watching Richard destroy himself to save us is the hardest thing I've ever done. He came home today after 3 weeks in Germany. He could barely stand, but he'd closed a deal that will secure Marcus's education and more. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that Marcus needs his father, not his money. But I also know that if Richard dies tomorrow, that money will keep our son safe, fed, educated. How do I tell a dying man that he's making the wrong choice when every choice he makes is impossible? There were more entries, years of them, documenting his mother's struggle to support her husband's decision while mourning the family life they'd lost. She'd loved Richard until the end, that much was clear. But she'd also resented him, felt abandoned by him, even as she understood why he'd made the choices he made. The complexity of her emotions mirrored Marcus's own feelings, and reading her words was like looking into a mirror that showed both past and present. His father's letter continued. By the time your mother died, I'd been cancer-free for 9 years, but the damage was done. You were a man by then, building your own life, keeping me at arm's length. I didn't fight it. I told myself you were better off without me meddling in your life. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid of your rejection, afraid that if I tried to explain everything, you'd hate me even more for the years I'd stolen from us both. So I did what I'd always done. I threw myself into work, into building the fortune that you've envied your whole life. Marcus's throat was tight. He picked up his father's favorite pen from the desk, a Mont Blanc that Richard had carried for decades. He'd watched his father sign countless documents with this pen, watched him tap it against his lips when he was thinking, watched him set it down with satisfaction after closing another deal. It had always seemed like a symbol of his father's success, but now Marcus wondered if it had been something else, a talisman, perhaps, a reminder of what he was working for. You think I was content, Marcus. You think I chose this life and was happy with my choice, but every success was ashes in my mouth without you there to share it. Every building I put my name on was a monument to my failure as a father. Every charity gala, every industry award praising my business acumen, they all felt like mockery because I'd won at everything except the thing that mattered most. The next section of papers detailed the structure of Richard's fortune. Marcus had assumed his father's wealth was simply money in accounts, stocks, bonds, the usual portfolio of a successful businessman. But as he read through the documents James had prepared, he began to understand the truth. The fortune was a machine, carefully constructed over decades, designed not just to generate wealth, but to accomplish specific purposes. There were trusts for education, set up to fund scholarships for children of single parents. There were investment funds that specifically supported businesses owned by people fighting terminal illnesses, giving them the capital to build something lasting for their families. There were foundations that paid for experimental medical treatments, the same kind that had saved Richard's life, for people who couldn't afford them otherwise. Every piece of the Harrison empire had been built with purpose, directed towards helping others avoid the impossible choices Richard had faced. The money was never the point, the letter explained. It was never about being rich or successful or having my name on buildings. It was about taking the extra years I'd been given and using them to make sure other fathers didn't have to choose between being present and being prepared. Every dollar I made after the cancer went into remission went towards building something that would outlast me, something that would help families stay together even in the face of catastrophe. Marcus discovered that the hospital wing bearing his father's name wasn't just a vanity project. It was a specialized cancer treatment center that provided free care to parents of young children. The university building was the home to a program that gave full scholarships to students who'd lost parents to terminal illness. Even the business holdings, the corporations and real estate that Marcus had envied, were structured to maximize charitable giving, with profits funneled into foundations and trusts that would continue the work long after Richard was gone. You think I was content, Marcus. You think I chose this life and was happy with my choice. But every success was ashes in my mouth without you there to share it. Every building I put my name on was a monument to my failure as a father. Every charity gala, every industry award praising my business acumen, they all felt like mockery because I'd won at everything except the thing that mattered most. The next section of papers detailed the structure of Richard's fortune. Marcus had assumed his father's wealth was simply money in accounts, stocks, bonds, the usual portfolio of a successful businessman. But as he read through the documents James had prepared, he began to understand the truth. The fortune was a machine, carefully constructed over decades, designed not just to generate wealth, but to accomplish specific purposes. There were trusts for education, set up to fund scholarships for children of single parents. There were investment funds that specifically supported businesses owned by people fighting terminal illnesses, giving them the capital to build something lasting for their families. Every piece of the Harrison empire had been built with purpose, directed towards helping others avoid the impossible choices Richard had faced. The money was never the point, the letter explained. It was never about being rich or successful or having my name on buildings. It was about taking the extra years I'd been given and using them to make sure other fathers didn't have to choose between being present and being prepared. Every dollar I made after the cancer went into remission went towards building something that would outlast me, something that would help families stay together even in the face of catastrophe. Marcus discovered that the hospital wing bearing his father's name wasn't just a vanity project. It was a specialized cancer treatment center that provided free care to parents of young children. The university building was the home to a program that gave full scholarships to students who'd lost parents to terminal illness. Even the business holdings, the corporations and real estate that Marcus had envied, were structured to maximize charitable giving, with profits funneled into foundations and trusts that would continue the work long after Richard was gone. You think I was content, Marcus. You think I chose this life and was happy with my choice, but every success was ashes in my mouth without you there to share it. Every building I put my name on was a monument to my failure as a father.
Every charity gala, every industry award praising my business acumen, they all felt like mockery because I'd won at everything except the thing that mattered most. The next section of papers detailed the structure of Richard's fortune. Marcus had assumed his father's wealth was simply money in accounts, stocks, bonds, the usual portfolio of a successful businessman. But as he read through the documents James had prepared, he began to understand the truth. The fortune was a machine, carefully constructed over decades, designed not just to generate wealth, but to accomplish specific purposes. There were trusts for education, set up to fund scholarships for children of single parents. There were investment funds that specifically supported businesses owned by people fighting terminal illnesses, giving them the capital to build something lasting for their families. Every piece of the Harrison Empire had been built with purpose, directed towards helping others avoid the impossible choices Richard had faced. The money was never the point, the letter explained. It was never about being rich or successful or having my name on buildings. It was about taking the extra years I'd been given and using them to make sure other fathers didn't have to choose between being present and being prepared. Every dollar I made after the cancer went into remission went towards building something that would outlast me, something that would help families stay together even in the face of catastrophe. Marcus discovered that the hospital wing bearing his father's name wasn't just a vanity project. It was a specialized cancer treatment center that provided free care to parents of young children. The university building was the home to a program that gave full scholarships to students who'd lost parents to terminal illness. Even the business holdings, the corporation.
Sarah appeared at the door again, her expression concerned. "Marcus? It's after midnight. You need to sleep." He looked up at her, his face still wet with tears. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I need to tell you everything." She crossed the room quickly, alarm in her eyes. "What is it? What did you find?" Marcus handed her his father's letter. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to shock to something softer, something that looked like understanding mixed with sorrow. When she finished, she set the pages down carefully and took Marcus's hands in hers. "Oh, Marcus, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what he went through, and I'm sorry for what you went through. I don't even know what this is." "It's complicated," Marcus said, the word feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. He was trying to do the right thing, but he did it all wrong. Or maybe he did it the only way he could. I don't know anymore. Sarah squeezed his hands. "What are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when everything you thought you knew about your life turns out to be wrong? When the man you resented for choosing money over family turns out to have been fighting death itself, building an empire not out of greed, but out of desperate love? When you realize that your envy was directed at a phantom, a successful businessman who never actually existed, because the real man was always something different, something more complicated and broken and human. Marcus spent the next several days going through everything. James and the other executives came as his father had promised, walking him through the details of each foundation, each trust, each business venture. They showed him the lives that had been changed, the families that had been kept together, the patients who'd been given fighting chances they couldn't have afforded otherwise. The Harrison fortune wasn't a hoard of wealth. It was a machine for transforming tragedy into hope, built by a man who'd been given a second chance and dedicated the rest of his life to giving others the same opportunity. He met with people his father had helped, a woman whose husband had been diagnosed with brain cancer when their daughter was 2. Richard's foundation had paid for experimental treatments, and the man was now in remission, coaching his daughter's soccer team. A young entrepreneur whose father had died of leukemia, leaving the family bankrupt.
A scholarship from the Harrison Foundation had put him through college, and he was now running a successful tech startup, employing dozens of people. Story after story, life after life, all touched by his father's quiet work. He never wanted publicity for any of it, James explained, as they reviewed the Foundation's annual reports. He could have had his name on everything, could have used his philanthropy to build his public image, but he always insisted on anonymity when possible. He said the work wasn't about him, it was about the families. Marcus thought about all the times he'd seen his father's name in the news, always connected to business deals and financial success, never to the charitable work that consumed the profits of those deals. Richard had been content to be known as a ruthless businessman, had let the world and his own son think the worst of him, rather than publicize the good he was doing. Why? Why allow everyone to believe he was what he wasn't? The answer came in another letter, this one from his mother, written shortly before her death. Marcus found it in a safety deposit box at the bank, filed under his name. My dearest Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and your father is still keeping his secrets. I've told him 1,000 times that he needs to tell you the truth about the cancer, about the choices he made, about why he was so often absent, but he refuses. He says he doesn't want your pity, doesn't want you to feel obligated to him because of his illness, doesn't want the work he's doing to be seen as redemption for his failures as a father. He's a stubborn, foolish, prideful man, and I love him desperately despite it all. His mother's letter continued, offering her own perspective on the years Marcus had experienced as abandonment. She wrote about watching Richard push himself beyond exhaustion, about finding him asleep at his desk after working through the night on another deal, about the way he would sit in Marcus's room and watch him sleep, the only time he could be present without the demands of business pulling him away. She wrote about the conversations they'd had, the arguments where she'd begged him to slow down, to choose differently, and his quiet insistence that he was doing what he had to do. I don't know if he was right, she wrote. I don't know if there was a better way, a choice that would have given us all more of what we needed. But I know he believed he was doing the right thing, the only thing, to protect us. And I know that every day he lived with the guilt of choosing our financial security over our emotional connection. Don't let anyone tell you your father didn't care, Marcus. He cared so much it destroyed him, piece by piece, day by day, until there was nothing left but the work and the hope that somehow, someday, you'd understand. Marcus realized that his father's greatest fear wasn't death. He'd faced death and beaten it twice. His greatest fear was that Marcus would never understand, never see past the absent father to the desperate man trying to do the impossible, trying to be two different fathers at once, the present one and the prepared one. And Richard had been so paralyzed by that fear, so convinced that Marcus would reject any explanation he offered, that he'd chosen to remain silent, to die with the truth locked away, revealed only through letters that wouldn't argue back or demand emotional responses he didn't know how to give. Sarah found him in the study again, surrounded by papers and photographs he'd discovered in his father's files. Pictures of Marcus at every age, clipped from school photos and candid shots his mother had taken, filed carefully away. His father had kept every drawing Marcus had made as a child, every report card, every newspaper clipping from his high school debate team victories, every artifact of the life he'd missed while building his empire. In one folder, he found letters Richard had written but never sent, dozens of them, attempts at communication that never made it past the draft stage. I tried to write to you today, to tell you I was proud of your graduation speech, that hearing you talk about the importance of being present for the people you love cut me deeper than you could know. But I'll put this with the others and go back to work, building something that I hope will speak for me when I no longer can." "He really did love you," Sarah said softly, looking over his shoulder at the letters. "In his own broken, impossible way, he loved you so much." "I know," Marcus replied, and he found that he meant it. The understanding had been building over days, washing away the old resentment like waves eroding a cliff face. The envy was still there, but it had changed, transformed into something else. He no longer envied his father's fortune. If anything, he pitied the man who'd built it, who'd sacrificed everything to create security for a son who'd spent decades wishing his father had been poor and present instead of rich and remote. The lawyers had given him a month to make his decision about the estate. He used every day of it, diving deep into his father's work, understanding the scope and scale of what Richard had built. The fortune was vast, yes, but it was also fragile, dependent on active management and careful stewardship. If Marcus walked away, James and the others would find someone to take over, but the transition would be difficult, and some of the work might falter or fail during the changeover. People who depended on the foundations might lose their support. Families who counted on the scholarships might find them discontinued. Patients who needed the experimental treatments might be left with nowhere to turn. On the other hand, taking over his father's empire meant dedicating his life to the same work that Richard's life had consumed, following in the footsteps of a man who'd let his family relationships wither in service to helping strangers. He would become his father in a very real sense, taking on the same responsibilities, making similar sacrifices, potentially destroying his own marriage the way Richard's choices had damaged his relationship with Marcus and his mother. Was that really what he wanted? To inherit not just the fortune, but also the curse that came with it? He talked it over with Sarah night after night, weighing the options. She listened patiently, offering perspective but never pushing him toward a particular choice. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But Marcus, you need to be honest with yourself about why you're deciding it. Are you taking over because it's what you want, or because you feel guilty for misjudging your father? Are you walking away because you genuinely think it's the wrong?"
He went to visit one of the hospitals his father's foundation supported, not as the heir reviewing his assets, but as a son trying to understand his father's choices. He met a young father named David, whose daughter Emma was undergoing treatment for leukemia. The foundation was covering the costs of an experimental therapy that David's insurance had refused to pay for. "Mr. Harrison saved my daughter's life," David said, tears in his eyes as Emma played with blocks on her hospital bed, already showing signs of improvement. "I don't know who he was or why he did it, but every night when I tuck Emma in, I think about the man who made this possible, someone who'd never met my daughter but cared enough to make sure she had a fighting chance." Marcus watched Emma play, her bright eyes and infectious giggle at odds with the IV line in her arm and the hospital surroundings. This was what his father had been working for, these moments, these lives. Every hour Richard had spent in his office, every business trip he'd taken, every dinner he'd missed with Marcus, they'd all been payments made against this child's future, and thousands like her. It didn't make those choices right, didn't erase the damage they'd caused, but it gave them context, purpose, meaning beyond the abandonment Marcus had felt. That night he made his decision. He called James and asked for a meeting with all the key executives the next morning. Sarah held his hand as he explained what he'd decided. "I'm going to take it over," he said, "but I'm going to do it differently.
My father built something incredible, but he paid too high a price for it. I'm not going to make the same mistakes. We're going to restructure everything to be more sustainable, bring in more people to share the workload, create systems that don't depend on one person sacrificing their entire life to keep it running." James nodded slowly. "Your father tried to do that near the end. He knew the pace he'd set wasn't sustainable, but he'd built the empire around himself, and he didn't know how to step back from it. If you can figure out how to maintain the work without destroying yourself in the process, you'll accomplish something he never could." Over the next months, Marcus threw himself into the transformation. He brought in new leadership, delegated responsibilities, created redundancies so no single person was indispensable. He met with foundation recipients and charity partners, learning their stories, understanding their needs, and crucially, he set boundaries. He worked hard, yes, but he came home for dinner. He turned off his phone on weekends. He made sure Sarah knew she was his priority, not his afterthought. "Your father would be proud," James told him one day as they reviewed the quarterly reports. The foundations were growing, helping more people than ever, but the organizational structure was healthier, more balanced. He'd also be a little jealous. "You've managed to do what he couldn't, have both the work and the life." But Marcus wasn't sure his father would be jealous. As he understood Richard better, he realized his father had wanted this for him, had hoped that Marcus wouldn't repeat his mistakes. The letter, the truth revealed after death, it was Richard's way of giving Marcus what he'd never had himself, a choice made with full knowledge of the costs and consequences. Richard had stumbled into his impossible situation and made the best choices he could with the understanding he had. Marcus got to choose with his father's experience lighting the way. He started a new tradition. Once a month, he'd bring Sarah to the cemetery, and they'd sit by his father's grave. Marcus would tell Richard about the work, about the families they'd helped, about the changes he'd made to the structure. He'd talk about his doubts and struggles, about the days when the work felt overwhelming, and he understood a little better why his father had become so consumed by the work. And sometimes he'd just sit in silence, feeling the complicated tangle of emotions that came with loving a man he'd spent most of his life resenting. "I understand now," Marcus said during one of these visits, his hand resting on the cold marble of his father's headstone. "I understand why you made the choices you made. I don't know if they were the right choices. Maybe there weren't any."
Right choices, just different versions of wrong that you had to pick from. But I understand that you were trying, in your broken way, to be the father you thought I needed. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. "Do you think you've forgiven him?" Marcus considered the question. Forgiveness felt too simple, too clean for something this complicated. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, but I've stopped being angry. I've stopped envying him. Mostly I'm just sad. Sad for the relationship we never had, sad for the pain we both carried, sad that he died thinking I'd never understand. But I'm also grateful. He gave me a chance to do this differently, to build on his work without repeating his mistakes." A year after his father's death, Marcus stood at a podium in the newly renamed Harrison Family Foundation headquarters. He was announcing a major expansion of their programs, new initiatives to support families facing terminal illness, not just with money, but with counseling, respite care, and community support. The goal was to help families stay together emotionally, not just financially, to make sure no one had to choose between being present and being prepared. "My father built an empire," Marcus told the assembled donors, staff, and beneficiaries. "But he lost his family building it. He did extraordinary good for thousands of people, but he sacrificed his relationship with the person who mattered most to him, his son. I spent most of my life envying his success and resenting his absence, never understanding that the two were inseparably linked. Today, we're launching these new programs in his honor, not to celebrate what he did, but to try to spare others from having to make the impossible choices he faced."
After the event, several people approached Marcus with their own stories. A woman whose father had been diagnosed with ALS when she was young, who'd watched him work frantically to build financial security for the family before the disease took his ability to work. A man who'd been given 3 months to live 30 years ago and spent every remaining day trying to make up for the time he'd thought he'd lost. Story after story of people trying to love their families by providing for them, not realizing that what their families needed most was their presence, their time, their emotional availability. "Your father wasn't alone," an older man told Marcus, his eyes wet with understanding. "So many of us make the same mistake. We think love is about providing, protecting, building security, and those things matter, they do. But we forget that love is also about showing up, being present, sharing the small moments. By the time we figure that out, it's often too late." Marcus thought about his own life, about the choices he'd made since taking over his father's work. He'd tried to be present, tried to maintain balance, but there were still days when the work consumed him, when Sarah ate dinner alone because he was on a call with lawyers or meeting with foundation directors. He was doing better than his father had, but he wasn't perfect. The pull of the work was strong, the knowledge that every hour he spent on it might save a life, help a family, make a difference in ways his personal life never could. "How do you do it?" he asked Sarah one night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest. "How do you live with my work, the hours I spend on the foundation, the time I give to other people's families? Don't you ever resent it, the way I resented my father for the same thing?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin. "Sometimes," she admitted, "sometimes I want you to say no to one more meeting, one more trip, one more urgent call. But Marcus, you're not your father. You're here right now, present with me. You ask me how I'm feeling. You make time for us. Your father couldn't figure out how to do both, but you're trying. That's the difference." But was trying enough? Marcus wrestled with the question constantly. He was helping people, yes, continuing and expanding his father's work, but what if Sarah got sick? What if they had children, and he found himself missing the moments his father had missed with him? What if, despite his best intentions and careful planning, he ended up destroying his family relationships in service of helping strangers, repeating the cycle his father had started? He found some answers in an unexpected place. Marcus had started a support group for children of parents who'd faced terminal illnesses, wanting to understand their experiences better. During one meeting, a young woman named Rachel shared her story. Her mother had been diagnosed with cancer when Rachel was 7 and chose to spend her remaining months present with her family rather than pursuing aggressive treatment that might have extended her life. "She died when I was 8, Rachel said, her voice steady but sad. "And for years I was angry about it, angry that she'd given up, that she'd chosen not to fight. But as I got older, I realized what a gift she'd given me. I had 1 year of really having my mom, fully present, creating memories that have sustained me for the 20 years since. She died poor, and I struggled because of it, but I had her love, completely and without reservation, for that 1 year. I don't know if it was the right choice, but it was her choice, and I'm grateful for it." Marcus thought about his own experience, about the contrast between Rachel's experience and his own. His father had chosen to fight, to build, to prepare, and lived 40 years doing it. But Marcus had none of the memories Rachel cherished, no year of complete presence, no time when his father had been fully his. Was Rachel's 1 year of presence worth more than Marcus's 40 years of absence? The question had no answer, or perhaps it had too many answers, different for every person, every family, every impossible situation. What Marcus came to understand was that his father had made a choice in an impossible situation, and it was neither completely right nor completely wrong. Richard had saved lives, including potentially his own son's financial security if circumstances had been different, but he'd also damaged the relationships that mattered most to him,
his wounds that might never fully heal. The tragedy wasn't that he'd chosen wrong. The tragedy was that he'd been forced to choose at all, that the world was structured in a way that made presence and preparation seem like opposing forces rather than compatible goals. That understanding shaped the next evolution of the Harrison Foundation's work. Marcus pushed for policy changes, lobbying for better insurance coverage for terminal illnesses, for family leave protections, for safety nets that would prevent people from having to choose between time with their families and financial security for their futures. Marcus couldn't change the past, couldn't give his father a better set of options, but he could work towards a future where fewer people faced those impossible choices. Sarah eventually became pregnant, a surprise after years of thinking it wouldn't happen. Marcus was terrified. Would he become his father now, so focused on providing for his child's future that he missed their present? Would the work of the foundation consume him the way it consumed Richard, leaving his own child with the same resentment Marcus had carried for so long? On the day his daughter was born, Marcus held her tiny body and wept, thinking of his father holding him the same way 38 years earlier, knowing he had cancer, knowing he might not survive to see this infant grow. What did Richard feel in that moment? Terror, certainly, and determination, and love so fierce that it drove him to make choices that would haunt both of them for decades. "I'm going to do this differently," Marcus whispered to his daughter, her small hand wrapped around his finger. "I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to continue your grandfather's work, but I'm going to make sure you know your father's voice, your father's laugh, your father's presence. You'll never have to envy me or resent me or wonder if I loved you, because I'm going to show you every single day." And he tried. Marcus restructured his schedule, brought in more help at the foundation, delegated responsibilities he'd been holding too tightly. He made sure he was home for breakfast and dinner, present for the bedtime routine, available for the small moments that make up a childhood. It wasn't perfect. There were still trips and urgent calls and days when the work pulled at him, but he was present more than absent, involved more than distant, and his daughter knew him in ways Marcus never knew Richard. On her 3rd birthday, Marcus drew a picture of their family, 4 stick figures holding hands with a house and a son. He gave it to Marcus proudly, and he filed it carefully in his office, thinking of all the drawings he'd made that his father had saved but never acknowledged. That night, he took the picture to his father's grave. "She knows me, Dad," he said, sitting in the grass beside the headstone. "She knows my voice, knows I'll be there to pick her up when she falls, knows when I promise to read her a story, I'll follow through. I got to have what you and I never had. I don't know if that makes me luckier than you, or if it just makes our loss more obvious, but I needed you to know. I'm not making the same mistakes you made, but I'm also not abandoning what you built. I found a way to do both, or at least I'm trying." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and Marcus imagined it was his father's voice, telling him he was proud. He'd always been proud. He'd just never known how to say it. Maybe that was true, or maybe Marcus was creating comfort where none existed. Either way, he chose